Welcome back to Endurance Icons, where we sit down with individuals crushing it in the wide world of endurance sports. We got an awesome guest for you today. We got Jeff Sankoff on the podcast today, who is a triathlon coach, licensed physician, and a podcast host at the TriDoc Podcast. So make sure you check that out as well. We'll link that in our show notes. But we're super pumped to have Jeff on today. How you doing today, Jeff?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate being here.
Jeff, we're really excited to have you on the show. And I think a lot of times it's very common to have an athlete and a coach. But what's really fascinating is the fact that you're a physician as well. And I think that it's so fascinating how you can bring all of those together. So, can you give a little bit of a background on all of those three and how those work together for you?
Yeah. Well, I was a physician first. Back, 25 years ago now, I was finishing up my training as a emergency physician and intensivist, and I had one of those moments where I realized I was just about on the cusp of finishing my training. I was going to have a lot of free time all of a sudden, and also was very much out of shape and overweight and facing what I like to think of as my Andy Dufresne moment, if you're familiar with the Shawshank Redemption, where
Yes.
he says, "Get busy living or get busy dying." And I kind of was facing that. And so I needed something to do. And I just basically started getting into shape and doing some things to be more active and eventually found my way into multisport. And it's been a lifelong passion ever since then. And I quickly realized that I could easily marry my passions for medicine with my passions for multisport and give back to the community that really gave me so much. And so I first started working with different publications like Triathlete and Inside Triathlon, contributing as a medical contributor and writing articles on health and well-being. And then as I just progressed further and further into multisport, decided that there was kind of a vacuum in terms of knowledge about so many things that are marketed to us. And that's where my podcast came about. And I started coaching as well about five years ago now. And I work with a lot of athletes who come to me with either chronic injuries or who don't want to get injured, older athletes who have specific questions about how to train with their the fact that they're older and the fact that they want to achieve things. And so it's just been a way to leverage my knowledge of physiology and health and also my love for multisport.
And I love what you were saying of that you saw this vacuum. What would you say are some of the greatest misconceptions that you've seen as a physician that is rampant in the world of triathlon?
I guess the biggest thing is that just because you can measure something means that you have to. I think that the greatest example of this in the last few years is continuous glucose monitoring. That is a technology that has been employed for diabetics for quite a long time. And suddenly these technology companies were like, hey, there's a finite number of diabetics, but there's this much larger number of non-diabetics. Maybe we could exploit that market and bring this to them. And we know how much athletes love to measure data. So let's foist this data onto those folks and convince them that this is yet another metric that they need. And over and over again, we see this, that there's companies that will suggest that you need to know something. I think that there's these other companies that market, know your blood panels, know your genetics, know all of these things, and that somehow this is going to make you, somehow smarter about being able to go faster or recover better. And in reality, it's just not the case. You just need to invest the time and the money into yourself, and you're going to get so much more. And just because you can know something doesn't mean you have to know it.
I love that. And how would you say when you bring this approach as a physician to your coaching, what does that do to the philosophies that you have in your coaching?
Well, I bring so that specifically I bring mostly to my podcast. So that's like my philosophy for my podcast is there are all these things marketed to athletes. I pride myself on having this knowledge base that allows me to interpret the real science out there and to help people understand what's being said and whether or not it is true or not, and whether or not that applies to them. And I'll help my athletes with that as well. But I think my philosophy with my athletes is really focused around, let's help you set some goals that work for your life and work for your abilities. And everybody wants to, most people come to me and they're like, oh, I want to win, or I want to go to Kona or Nice or whatever. And I'll be like, okay, well, let's look at where you're at now, and let's look at where you want to go, and let's look at what your life is right now, and let's see what we can do to help you configure things. Because I think too many times, I know I made this mistake in triathlon, is I tried to make my life fit what I wanted to do in triathlon, and that didn't work. And I try to help my athletes now as a very busy physician and a father and a husband. My philosophy with my athletes is we have to make your training fit your life, and then have that be commensurate with the goals that you're trying to achieve in multi-sport. So and then as a physician, I also look at the athletes as a whole person, as, where are you coming from? Where are you trying to go? How are we going to get you there as injury-free as possible?
It's awesome. Looking back, just jumping back to your podcast there, because you've had some really interesting tools, products, people on your podcast. When you look back on that, is there some that really, or an episode that really jumps out at you as a product or tool that was like, oh, wow, like this could really make a huge difference to people? Anything that kind of jumps out at you?
Yeah, I've done 141 episodes now, and in all of those episodes, I think there are 5, maybe 6 things that we have found that actually have the benefits that are behind, that they say they do. And they're just about all natural things. None of them are these highfalutin, high-tech, very expensive things. And all of them are natural products. So one of them is spirulina. Spirulina is blue-green algae. It's very cheap. It's widely abundant. It was once considered a superfood, the superfood of the future, because it's very high in protein and vitamins and all these other things. And there's really good scientific evidence to support the fact that spirulina actually does do a lot of good things for athletes. So that's one of them. Beetroot juice is another one. Although the interesting thing about beetroot juice is it's probably not that applicable for triathletes because its effects are so short-lived. And triathlons being fairly long events, the effects of beetroot juice wear off long before the triathlon is into its halfway mark. But for short events, like short running events, short cycling events, beetroot juice is quite effective, with the caveat that it doesn't seem to have quite the impact for women as it does for men, which is interesting because women have a higher baseline. So the way beetroot juice works is it works by increasing the amount of nitric oxide in your blood. I'm not going to get into all the weeds here, but women have a baseline higher amount of nitric oxide already. So the supplement that they get from beetroot juice doesn't seem to impact them quite as much. Caffeine is another one we found, another natural product. And then the other couple of things that we found that were really helpful, tart cherry juice, really, really helpful for men and women. And then sleep and tapering. So those are the six things I think I just mentioned that we have found over 140 episodes that truly have good science. And then one other thing, sorry, your microbiome. Really, really interesting. We did a lot of deep dive on some of the research on keeping your microbiome healthy, and that was probably one of the more fascinating episodes that I really enjoyed doing because I was so surprised to see what an impact a healthy microbiome can have on endurance performance.
And that's such an interesting call out because I think with all the movement and the amount of sugar that we're dumping into our body, it's so often we don't even think about what it means to maintain a healthy microbiome. So yeah, it's a great takeaway. I guess what would for anyone who hasn't listened to that episode, what is like the key headline to maintain a healthy microbiome for a high performance athlete?
It's not a real key headline because it's a complicated issue, but I think there's a couple of things I would say. Eat a well-balanced, healthy diet. So make sure you're getting foods that contain probiotics in them. So that could be yogurt, cottage cheese, kombucha, kimchi, pickles, all of those things that are fermented or have active culture in them. That's going to help keep your microbiome healthy. and then avoid at all costs unnecessary antibiotics. As a physician, I encounter so many patients who come to me requesting antibiotics for things that they don't need antibiotics. And we in Western society have this kind of learned we learn it as kids. At least I did in my generation. You know, we had an ear infection. We raced over to the doctor. Our parents did. They took us, and we learned that you were only successfully treated if you walked away with a prescription. And more, we are learning that antibiotics are unnecessary most of the time. And too often, I see people coming to me asking for antibiotics for things that just don't need them. Ear infections for your kids, sinusitis, bronchitis. Those are things that are way overprescribed. They wipe out your microbiome and they cause major impacts on endurance performance, not just and overall health as well.
Ooh, very interesting stuff. I know you work as part of the life sport coaching team as well. What kind of got you started with them? I've always thought of Lance Watson as a really highly regarded coach. What kind of got you started with them, and what is it about kind of that team and philosophy that resonates with you?
Well, 20 years ago, when I first got into triathlon, I attended a camp, a CTS camp, Carmichael Training Systems. That was back in 2004, 3, I think it was. I was down in Colorado Springs, and Lance was a coach with CTS at the time. And that's where I first met him. And it started a friendship that lasted for all of this time. And when I started coaching about 5 years ago, I approached Lance and asked him if he would consider mentoring me. And at the time, he said, well, you know, I usually just do that with the coaches I work with as part of Life Sport. But because we had this pre-existing relationship, he agreed to work with me on a sort of informal basis. And over the next several months, as we worked together, he came to know me as a coach, and he eventually invited me to join the team over at Life Sport. And it's been just a terrific relationship that I've had with him and with Coach Juliet Hockman, who has become a good friend of mine, and the rest of the crew. And I just really enjoy the ability to work with Lance as closely as I do. He's now actually my personal coach, and that's been just a great evolution of that relationship. And also just the way that we provide as much as we do for our athletes on an ongoing basis with group activities. I'm actually going to the third annual spring training camp with them coming up in May. So it's just been a really good relationship for me as a coach and for the athletes that work with me there.
Very cool. And I know on a personal side with Lance coaching you, you've been to Kona a couple times, haven't you?
I have. Lance just started coaching me this year.
Okay.
My previous coach I was with for many years, unfortunately passed away in November over Thanksgiving. Steve Johnson was his name. He was part of his company was Dark Horse Coaching. I owed a tremendous amount to him. He had a huge impact on me personally. And when he had melanoma and passed away over Thanksgiving, and it was a huge loss. And I continue to be affected by that. It's amazing. You don't recognize what a relationship you have with your coach
Mhm.
until something like that happens. But I was very grateful that I work as closely as I do with Lance, and I was able to seamlessly transition over and now have Lance as my coach. And yeah, I look forward to continued success.
Oh, we're sorry to hear that. Is there some like big things that you really learned from your old coach before that you, when you look back on it, you really took away in those years? Like some really overarching things that helped you become such a good athlete like you are today?
Yeah, so many things. And it's not just Steve, you know. I mean, Lance had a big part. Even though Lance wasn't my official coach, he definitely always sort of helped me. And I had a team, right? I think you have to have a team to succeed. I worked with a mental performance coach as well because I started like so many do. I was an adult onset swimmer. I didn't know how to swim. I had to learn how to swim. I worked very, very hard at swimming for a very long time. And one of the things that Steve taught me very early on was despite the fact you may not think you're ever going to be a good swimmer, and despite the fact that you don't enjoy necessarily training for the swim, if you don't swim more, you're never going to have a good race. And he taught me something that I now continue with my own athletes, that more swimming is integral to having a good race because
Mhm.
getting out of the water without being tired, without having a super high heart rate is the key to having, it sets you up for the whole day, even though it's the shortest part of the day, even though you're out of the water in a fraction of the time that will be your entire race, no matter what distance you're doing. If you can get out of the water feeling fairly fresh, then you are set up for a good day. And that was one of the most important things Steve taught me, and something that I continue to believe is so integral for my own athletes. Another thing that he taught me was just to believe that I was as good as he thought I was, because I never thought I spent most of my career at the back of the pack, then eventually got my way up to the middle, started to inch my way forward, and he always felt like I had the capability to be on the podium. And I just kept thinking, oh, there's no way. I don't look like those people. I don't, I mean, the gap between them and me just seems insurmountable. And he just kept pushing and pushing and said, you just need to commit. And when I finally committed, I started to see those results and started to get there. But to get to the top step, which I finally achieved, really required a switch in gears mentally. And that was where I had to get that mental performance coach as well.
Very cool. I'd love to focus a little bit around some of your coaching philosophies when it comes to some of the disciplines and some of the pieces around training. So you had started initially talking about swimming here. So if we maybe use the lens today of, we have a lot of like long distance triathletes that listen to this who are focusing on a lot of the 70.3 or Ironman distance. Talk to us a little bit about your swimming coaching philosophy when it comes to how many times people should be swimming per week. So what kind of workouts are you given? Are you throwing in a lot of drills or toys? What does your philosophy look like around the swim?
Sure. With the caveat that I will adjust for the individual, because not everybody can, my standard sort of thought process is, if you're training for a half Ironman or an Ironman, you're going to be swimming 10K per week. That's 9 to 10K per week. That's sort of my starting philosophy. However, I have athletes who just can't do that because their swim speed or swim pace is so slow starting out that if I were to do that, they would be spending so many hours in the pool that it's not practical. So I will adjust, and that's a back and forth conversation with athletes. But if they're able to do it, if they're able to swim 3,000 to 3,200 in a workout that takes them less than an hour and 15 minutes, then I try to get them to do that 3 times a week for a half Ironman or an Ironman. And those workouts are, I don't spend a lot of time with drills, mostly because I personally have not found drills to be hugely impactful on my own swimming. I think we are so disconnected in the water from our mental image, and drills really work on emphasizing this kind of like, okay, we want you to do this thing in the drill, but then the second we start swimming, the drill is out the window. And I think it's because you can emphasize a drill with running, and we have a much better proprioception or idea of where our body is in space when we're outside of the water. But the second we're in the water, we lose that completely. And so my philosophy about swimming is, look, I may not be able to fix your form dramatically, but I'm going to make you as fit as possible with whatever form you have, so that when you cover the distance of the race, you might improve by, I don't know, a minute, 2 minutes from what your previous time was, but I know you're going to improve in that you're going to get out of the water and feel much less fatigued, and your heart rate's going to be much lower. And that is a huge win, much more important than knocking off an extra 30 seconds or so. That being said, if I take video of all of my athletes and we look for specific things that we want to work on, and we do end up usually improving their times a little bit. So to answer your question, it's volume is usually 9 to 10K per week. And within those sets, or within those swim sets, some of it is just endurance swimming, but a lot of it is swimming fast. Because I think if you learn to swim fast, you'll be able to swim fast during a race. So it's a lot of hundreds, it's a lot of 200s, and then there'll be longer sets of 400s where it's more at an endurance pace. So it's a mix of short, fast intervals with longer endurance type intervals.
Yeah, that's great. I think the video part you said is so important for the athletes, especially if you're going to put drills in. They need to have seen themselves swim first to like start to register where they were actually going wrong and put that together. I think that's a huge component of it.
Yeah, and it's not to say I don't ever give drills, but I'm kind of minimalistic on which drills I give and
Mhm.
how often I give them because I recognize in myself that drills have had only so much impact. I think the biggest impact for me is working, when I show someone a video and I say, look, we all do this, right? We all make this thing with our arm. And any swim coach, we're always doing this with the arm. Anyway, so I always say, look, we want to work on that catch, the high elbow, and the pull. I mean, those are the three things. And then the last part is making sure that we have our arms in that front quadrant. So that's the things that I work on. The drills I'll give will be things like catch-up drill, fist drill. Those are the major ones that I'll work with.
What are some tips you have for people to help improve their body position in the water? If you have an athlete who's like dragging their hips and legs along the bottom of the pool, what are some of your tips there?
Yeah, the big thing is really to give a lot of pull boy drills, to have them swim with what, floaty shorts or whatever you call them, the buoyancy shorts, because I think that it's so hard to fix adult swimmers to do that. I know for me, it took a really long time telling people, oh, swim downhill, push your chest into the water. It's like getting that sort of in people's head. First of all, they don't like to have their face in the water. And so getting them to stop lifting their head is a big thing. Having them understand to keep the water so that one eye is in the water when they turn to breathe. That's always very helpful, I find. But the big thing is especially with muscular men, they have like bigger leg muscles. Their legs are going to sink. And so having them swim with a pull buoy, having them swim with floaty shorts, I find that helps them feel that they are able to move more quickly with less drag. But the big thing is showing them the video and showing them from the side that they're swimming with this leg sinking and how that's really impacting them. And then showing them with a pull buoy what the difference is and how they can move more quickly. So yeah, just really the whole thing with I find the biggest thing is the hips will follow the head. So if you can get them to keep their head down and recognize that they can breathe even with one eye in the water, that's the biggest victory. And that's what I try to do is make sure one eye can see underwater, one eye is above water when you turn your head to breathe, and you're going to be winning half the battle right there.
Nice. And moving along to next discipline, the bike, typically the biggest part of a triathlon. What are some of the areas of focus you put into workouts, form, anything along those lines to help your athletes be strong on the bike so they can set up for the run?
So I ask everybody to get a bike fit. I mean, I want
Yes.
everybody to be fit to their bike because everybody's always thinking, how much can I spend to get more aero? And I'm like, honestly, it doesn't matter what you've got, what bike you've got. If you are not properly fit so that you're comfortable, it doesn't matter. And then I've got people who are like, well, how low can I go? And it honestly doesn't matter. If you're not comfortable, if you can't maintain a position for a period of time, then it doesn't matter how aero you are. You have to be comfortable to be able to stay in a position. So I ask everybody get fit. And if they're hopefully they're getting fit before they buy a bike. But if they've already got the bike, then that's fine. Let's just get fit to what you've got and we'll work with what you've got. So it starts with fit first and foremost. I ask them to limit the amount of money they're going to spend on bits and bobs because it can get out of control very, very quickly. And then it's all about investing in the engine. I spend a lot of time with my athletes working on power in the early part of the season. So the early part of the season is a lot of above threshold stuff. I use WKO as my software that I help determine real-time FTP. So I don't do a lot of I'll do formal testing at the beginning, but after that, WKO gives me real-time FTP. So if you're not familiar with WKO, it's software that coaches use and I'm speaking now to the listeners, not to you guys, but it's a software that coaches can use to gather a lot of data, power data from their athletes, and it constructs a power duration model that gives a lot of information on your FTP, but also it provides insights for how to target intervals and zones for your athlete in designing workouts. And so I use WKO to help design my workouts early in the season to really drive that FTP higher. And I also use something that WKO, a metric that WKO has called time to exhaustion, TTE. And so early in the season, it's about driving your FTP higher, but also increasing your TTE, which is the time to exhaustion at a high percentage of FTP. So that's the early focus. And then we'll shift over to these really, really hard workouts, which are these 4 by 8 minute best efforts, where I ask the athlete to just give an 8 minute effort that they think is the highest power that they can hold for 8 minutes and then repeat 3 more times. And those will increase until we get to 4 by 16. And usually by the time we get to the end of that, we're ready to start really building out their endurance. So we'll drop those high intensity efforts and we'll start working on just longer sweet spot efforts and really building their endurance. And usually, that's where I'm at with most of my athletes now as we're heading into the end of March. So a lot of them are now starting to move outdoors and they're going to start doing a lot of outdoor riding in aero, doing longer efforts, hopefully doing some climbing. If they live where I live, they could start thinking about climbing. So it's a mix of power, it's a mix of endurance, but the idea now is getting them ready for that race prep sort of phase where I want them being able to sustain in that 75 to 90% of their FTP for longer and longer periods of time.
Awesome. Yeah, I spent way too much time in WKO as well. Love that software. It's awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
Fix
the curve.
Yeah, we need a 2-minute test to bump the
That's
curve.
right.
Oh man, that needs to be a separate offline chat where we can go deep on that stuff. So moving along to the run. So obviously one that is very dangerous for people to be able to get injured pretty quickly if they're ramping up too quickly from intensity volume. How do you go about kind of getting people into running safely and then building that out within the whole kind of triathlon vision?
Yeah, so I'm very, very attuned to the notion about running and injuries. I think we're very fortunate in triathlon that because you can get hurt in one, you've got two other sports that you can do at the same time, right? My son is a very, very avid runner. He's also 14, which means that he's at that time when he's growing. And so he's unfortunately constantly getting something. And right now he's dealing with jumper's knee and he's just morose because he can't run right now as he's rehabbing that. And yeah, I wish I could tell him just go to the pool. Go, he is a cyclist, but he doesn't have a dedicated trainer because my bike is on the trainer. So, but also his bike doesn't fit on my trainer. But anyways, that's aside. Our athletes can of course switch to the other two sports. But I'm very attuned to the fact that runners can get injured. So I spend the early part of the season, and anytime I start with a new athlete, it's all about, and I am not one of these zone 2 guys. I do not coach my athletes with zone 2 stuff. I think that's like you said, another conversation, but I think if you want to finish a race, zone 2 is fine. But if you want to actually compete in a race, zone 2 is for early season stuff, which is how I introduce my athletes to running. I get them running short durations at first, almost 3 to 4 times a week, always very, very easy zone 2 type stuff. And we'll build that up over the first month or two where it's just increasing volumes of very low intensity running just to get their body used to the fact that they're running more and more. And then once we've got them with a nice base, then we'll start introducing some of the intensity stuff, because let's face it, running injuries happen when you start running hills, when you start running intervals, and when you start doing things like long runs. So I want my runners to have a really good foundation before I start introducing any of those things. And the first thing that I'll usually introduce is the progression run, which is sort of a longer run, usually an hour or more, where I have them start at a pace, and then every mile that they complete, they then increase the pace by about 5 to 10 seconds per mile, so that when they finish, they're running usually 30 seconds per mile faster than when they started. And I really like progression runs because it simulates what happens in a triathlon, right? When you're doing a triathlon, you get to the end of a triathlon, you're exhausted. It's really hard to maintain your pace. And when you're doing these kinds of progression runs, even though it's only an hour and a half, whatever you're doing, the fact that you're having to run faster at the end when you're fatigued it kind of simulates that idea of trying to hold your pace when you're fatigued. So I like those progression runs. They're not as stressful on the body, but they do start to increase the amount of stress on running. After I've increased the duration of those progression runs, then I will start to introduce speed work. And speed work for me usually comes in the form of intervals of starting off at like half a mile or a kilometer, and then we'll go to mile intervals. And once I've got my athletes running successive weeks, I'll increase it. So we'll start by 4 by 1 mile at a threshold pace with about half that time for recovery. And then we'll build that up to 8, depending on what they're doing. If they're doing a half Ironman, I go up to 8, and then I'll go to 2 mile intervals. So if they've done 8, then they're going to drop down. They're going to do 3 by 2, and then they'll work their way up from there. And if they're doing an Ironman, then it's slightly different. It's going to be obviously longer, but it's a much slower build.
Very cool. And in this day and age, we talked a little bit about it before, but there's so much data out there, from power meters to heart rate monitors to GPS watches and Garmin's yelling at us that we're unproductive. Where does your kind of philosophy lie in like the athlete knowing effort and feel of intervals and being able to be in tune with that, but also paired with kind of the mass amount of data we have? Where do you work with your athletes on that?
Yeah, I mean, I want them to know and I want them to pay attention to things, but I always encourage them to understand the limitations to some of these things. So heart rate's a great example. There are so many things that can impact heart rate, and so I don't want them to be a slave to heart rate. Heart rate changes over the course of a workout. Heart rate's going to change depending on what day it is, because of what state they're in, because maybe they are working out later in the day or versus the morning. Maybe they had a cup of coffee or they didn't. Heart rate can really, really be variable. So while I want them, while I want them to follow kind of what they know is their ceiling heart rate for whatever activity they're doing, everything below that is a little bit to be taken with a grain of salt. So they don't have to be a slave to it. I don't follow running power meters. I think that's a misnomer. I think it's one of the many devices that came on the market with a lot of hype, and has over time not borne out. And I think the biggest problem with the Stride and the other running power meters is that they misnamed them. It has nothing to do with power. It's not actually power. It's more running efficiency. And I think if they had focused on running efficiency, that it might have had more success. Anyways, that's another story. But I think that the metrics that I follow, definitely bike power. I will follow heart rate as insofar as I watch for uncoupling between heart rate and effort. I follow run pace, obviously, but pace has to be with perceived exertion. I don't follow any of those Garmin metrics, not one of them. And the
They're
reason
so
for that
bad.
is, well, the reason for that is because every single one of them is tied to heart rate variability.
Mm.
And the heart rate variability is number one. If you're not wearing the watch 24 hours a day, the heart rate variability is useless, and almost nobody wears their watch 24 hours a day. And even if you do wear your watch 24 hours a day, heart rate variability is not the end all to be all that Garmin and some of the other proponents of heart rate variability would have you believe. Heart rate variability is based on chaos math. It's a very, very unpredictable sort of thing, and we are using it as a linear measure. If heart rate variability goes up, it must be good. If it goes down, it must be bad. That is not how chaos math works, and yet we are trying to use it that way, and it is inherently a flawed premise. And so for that reason, all of the Garmin measures are, to me, not particularly useful.
I think Mark would agree with you. I gave him a Whoop as a gift, and he stopped using it after a month. He's like, "This is so like wrong. It doesn't track everything right." So you just rejected it. You're like, "This isn't useful."
Well, and I think that's a great anecdote, because I see too many people, though. Like, I've had athletes who have called me and said, "Hey, I don't think I should do this workout today because my Garmin tells me." And
Yeah.
I said, "Well, how do you feel?" And they're like, "Oh, I feel fine." And I'm like, "Okay, how about you throw away the Garmin metric and you just do what you feel like?" And same thing for you, Jess, because I don't know, do you coach as well, Jess?
No.
No. So I've had female athletes come to me because they were using some of these menstruation trackers
Mhm.
promoted by a female physio person who I will not mention because I have issues with her. And she's all about, you need to follow your menstrual period and do exactly what your menstrual period says, blah, blah, blah. And they would say, oh, my menstrual tracker says I shouldn't exercise today. And I'm like, how do you feel? Oh, I feel fine. Okay. Well, then do what I mean, I think that yes, it goes back to this notion of too much data, right? You, it's useful to know some of these things, and it's useful to have them be kind of like potentially inform you. So if you wake up and you feel like crap, and then you look at one of these things and it's like, oh, my heart availability is really low or really poor, or my menstrual tracker says this is a bad day. Maybe that's why you feel like crap, or
Mhm.
maybe it's because you got something. I don't know what it is, but don't necessarily associate those two things and sort of capitulate to it. There's too many other things going on to make it always about that. And I think your experience with the Whoop, Mark, is like so many other people. And these are just they should be tools and not guides.
Mhm.
No, I completely agree with you. I think like with the cycle, the most important thing is, are you getting it or not? And I know that like when Mark takes athletes in, that is always a part of a conversation. But I think like you bumped up against a really important point of like that power of suggestion and mindset. So I think sometimes athletes negative way of just saying, okay, well, I couldn't possibly do my workout because, my device says that I can't, or that I'm not in a perfect form, which actually will impact them on race day. But you mentioned earlier on that what unlocked the performance for you was working with a mental coach. So I'd like to circle back on that and see like what were the key things that you worked on to unlock that next level for that mental game?
Yeah, so that's a long conversation, but
Cancel the rest of your day, Jeff.
yeah. So I, I was struggling. I was making the podium on a reasonably consistent basis, but it was always, 5, 4, 3 maybe, but I could not get to the top step. And I thought one day, well, why am I not able to get there? And I wonder how much of it has to do with just my belief, because I started interviewing people on my podcast who were mental performance coaches, and I would interview these people, and they would say things like, I show up believing I can win. And I'm looking at their results going, how could you believe you're going to win? You've never had any track record that suggests you're going to win. And how do you then not win and not be discouraged? So I couldn't put all of this together. And I was constantly asking people this question. I'm like, where does the confidence going to come that you're going to win if you've never won? Like, do you need to win in order to have the confidence, or can you go in with the confidence that you're going to win? And also like at what point is it unrealistic? Like I could say, oh, I see these people who say, oh, I'm going to win, I'm going to win. And I'm like, well, yeah, I could say I'm going to go to the Olympics, but it's not realistic, right? So like, when does it become unrealistic to have this confidence? And I kept getting kept tripping up over all this stuff. You remember Chris McCormick, the famous professional triathlete,
Macca, we
right?
love Macca.
Okay, yeah. He used to show up at Kona every year, and he used to just be like his braggadocio about how he was going to win. And all the other professional triathletes would just look at him and they'd be like, yeah, okay. Like go out on the course and show us because you've never been here. You have no idea what you're talking about. And the first few years he was there, he blew up. He never even finished the race until finally he figured it out. And when he finally figured it out, he was like, yeah, I probably should have shut up and just sort of like, shouldn't have been so bold until I actually understood what was going on. And I didn't want to be one of those people who would show up at a race. Oh, I'm going to win today. I just never
Mhm.
felt like I could. So I started working with this guy. And he helped me realize that it's okay to, well, first of all, he kept saying, like, what are you afraid of? Like what is holding you back? And he made me realize that, I would start the run is where it would all come apart because I'd get off the bike in a perfect position because I'm a very strong cyclist, but I would get off the bike and immediately I'd be like, well, I'm not a runner, so I'm just going to hold on. And he's like, well, why aren't you a runner? Like, and he made me recognize that I was holding myself back because I had this fear of failure. I mean, there's so much too also, right? All the baggage we carry from our childhood and everything else. And, he made me recognize all these things. And he made me realize that unless you commit, unless you really, really commit, unless you really, really kind of like dedicate to yourself and believe that you are able to accomplish something, then you're never going to do it. And it's okay to show up somewhere and feel like you're the best person. And if you're not on that day, that's all right. It doesn't diminish who you are in any way. It just means somebody else showed up who was better than you. It doesn't change who you were. And I had to stop worrying about who else was there, which was a big thing, right? Because I used to scope the start lists and be like, I'd see somebody and I'd be like, oh, well, that's it. I can't beat that person. And it's like, I had to stop doing that. I think we all were victims of doing that kind of thing in the past. I think the best thing that ever happened was when Ironman stopped publishing those start lists. I think
Yeah.
that was very helpful. Anyway, so I remember the first time I won, I showed up at Chattanooga and I had had a good swim. I got off the bike. I was having a great bike and I got off the bike and I started the run and I saw a friend of mine who said, you are 8 seconds in the lead. And I thought, oh crap, I'm not a runner. And then immediately I was like, well, no, today I'm a runner. I'm
Mhm.
going to run today. And I just like, I said, you know what? I just flipped a switch and I said, I'm just going to put it all on the line. And I'm just going to, if I blow up and I finish in last place, I don't care because if I don't put it all on the line and try, I will never know. And I did. I just put it all on the line. I had one of my fastest runs and I won by a lot. And I was like, and that was it. And then I understood what I needed to do. And it's like all of these years, I hadn't done what I needed to do, which was to risk because I'd been afraid. And it was a really, really interesting revelation. And I went on, I won all my races that year, all 70.3s. And the biggest one I won was my home race, Boulder, a race that I had struggled so many times. I had just barely missed the podium. I'd been off the podium. Like I finished in sixth one year by less than a second. And it was heartbreaking for me. And so Boulder was a race that I'd struggled with so much. And then I showed up and I was like, I had won Chattanooga, I had won Virginia, and I came to Boulder and I was like, I am going to put everything out here. And I did. And I won again, by a reasonable amount. And I was like, that's it, And last year I had medical issues and I didn't do quite as well, but I did as well as I could. And I was quite satisfied. But yeah, it's a totally once, and I can answer the question now, which is to say, yes, you don't have to win to be confident, but I will tell you, once you've won, it is so much easier to be confident
Mhm.
because it's a huge leap of faith to go into a race believing you can win if you haven't won before. But once you have won, it's so much easier to be confident.
And I love everything that you've just said because I had a very similar journey in terms of growth and development. And I think like the biggest thing that helped me was just stopped trying to be the best and try just to be the best that you can be that day. And when you focus on that, suddenly you're not allowing those negative stories because I find that the moment that you're comparing yourself to the rest of the field, then you're putting yourself in this place of lack or self-inflated confidence that isn't there. But, the more that I stay calm, the more likely I am to do really well. And I just to answer your like once you've won, it changes everything. Um, the very first time that I won a race, I'll never forget someone said, no one can ever take that away from you. So even if I have a terrible day inside, I can believe I'm like, no, but I've done it and I can do it again. So I love that repeatability of it. I just think the mental game is so important and it's in a different way than what people think. I think like true confidence is often quieter. You just hold it inside you. It's that self-talk rather than I'll say peacocking and just, spreading that around because what that looks like often is insecurity because that's often what it is. So I love this idea of of just holding on and knowing and unlocking the best in yourself. And would you say that is that how you prepare your athletes for races, or is there any other pieces of insight that you give to prepare them for their big performance?
I've spent a lot of time in the last year learning about flow state. And I spoke with Dr. Dia Grant on my podcast recently, and she really, really kind of helped me understand it a lot better than I had previously. And I'm much more attuned to it now when I go out for my long runs, because that's when I find I can achieve a flow state. And I am trying so hard to help my athletes get there, because even if you're not out there to win, and many of my athletes, I mean, let's face it, most of my athletes aren't, but I have a few who are. And if I can help them get to a flow state, you don't have to be winning to be in a flow state, but being in a flow state is such an endorphin rush. And so I just try to work with my athletes now just to try and make them get to that, because that is a mental victory. Because too many of my athletes are so distracted by anxiety and worry and fear, and they're focused on negatives. And so if I can help them purge the negative thoughts, and I do that by working really hard on, look, we are going to come up with a plan, and we're going to plan your race. You're going to race your plan, and we're going to prepare for every eventuality that we can think of, so that you've dealt with it in advance. And when you show up on race day, you don't have to worry about anything except just going through the motions. And the less distractions, the more you can just focus on the enjoyment of being and doing, then the more likely you are to get into this flow state and just enjoy and have the day that you want to have. And that to me is the victory.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree. And it's just managing all of those different variables. And it's not just on race day. You're doing that throughout your training as well. And what I mean by that is an example. Today on the way back we had Masters Swim this morning, and everything continues to change as your training continues to load up. Some other life factors might be influencing you. And I made a comment to Mark. I said, I'm a little bit more grumpy than I normally am this week. I'm a little bit more tired. And I said, yesterday I had 2 breakfasts, 2 lunches, a dinner, and a snack before bed. And I said, but I still, based on all of these variables, I think the sign is that I'm not getting enough. I said, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to bump it up just a little bit. I'm not a tracker or a measurer. But when you look at that complexity with your own athletes, how do you help them manage that and maybe self-identify? Because I think one of the challenges is when you start adding all the time that they need to train, you're going to be doing amateur athletes that aren't doing that for a living. How do you as a coach manage, the strength training, the nutrition, and the sleep that needs to fit in? How do you listen for those things that maybe they aren't telling you? I know that's a lot wrapped in, but how do you manage the complexity, Jeff?
That's a big question.
I know.
So I am for a person who's as busy as I am, I pride myself on being as accessible as possible to my athletes. So they all have my phone number. I hear from probably at least one athlete every single day. And I'm constantly texting with them, emailing with them, exchanging comments with them. I do my programming weekly, which I know is probably more than a lot of people do, but I know from myself as a busy professional that my schedule changes so quickly that I like to have my own schedule done weekly, because it allows me the most flexibility. So I do my own athletes weekly, and what that does is it allows me to really see what they're doing in as granular a way as possible. So it keeps me on top of where they're at. And I have one athlete, for example, who's really been going through a rough time at work. His team has been cut by 25%. His job has just become much more stressful. And so we're in touch continuously, and I am constantly asking the question, how can I make this easier for you? You've got enough on your plate already. I want to be the solution to your problems, not an additional issue. So I don't want training to ever be a stress for people. Training is supposed to be your respite from the rest of your life. So again, I go back to what I said before. Training needs to fit your life, not the other way around. If training is causing problems for you, then there's an issue here. And I need to be the solution to that. That's my role. So help me understand what's going on and help me find a way to make this better for you because I want you to look forward to your training and I want you to get to your training feeling like this is my half an hour, whatever it is that I can turn my mind off and get away from everything else that's going crazy in my life right now. I am watching continuously. My athletes provide. I'm not one of those coaches who answers comments on a daily basis, but I'm watching them on a daily basis. And so if they're putting, I ask them, put your comments, and I'm looking at them. And on a weekly basis, I send them all a video. I use Loom software where I do a video for every athlete where I look over what they did the last week. I show them what's coming up this week. I explain the why behind the process, and I'm looking at their data. I'm showing them. I'm like, look. Here's why you're feeling fatigued. This is what we've done over the last 3 weeks. And guess what? We have a nice recovery week coming up right now. And it's amazing how often I hear from my athletes, wow, you always get the recovery weeks right when I need them. And it's because I'm watching. So it's like I'm very careful to watch and make sure, like we talked earlier about how I'm always making, I feel like I'm in a good place to make sure people don't get injured. I'm also I think, in a good place to make sure they don't get overtrained. I do get asked a lot of questions about like nutrition and stuff, and I am not a dietitian. I do not play one on TV, so I don't try to do that too much. But I do I feel like I can give some basic advice on that, and I certainly can give some advice on healthful eating. But if they want more than that, I have lots of contacts who are registered dietitians, and I defer to them, and I'm more than happy to make those referrals. But I can definitely help with the basics.
No, I love that. At the very beginning, you'd mentioned about from your podcast some of the things that actually work. And looking into gear, the rise of there is some gimmicks out there, but there also is some scientific evidence behind things like carbon shoes and some bike positioning. Is there anything that you actually recommend for your athletes that are going to help them perform better?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, bang for the buck. Most of the bang for the buck definitely comes on the bike. So an aero helmet, I mean, that's cheap. And we know that that works. Aero bars, right? Aero bars on a road bike, if you can fit them, because sometimes the road bike is stretched out too much. So if you've got a road bike that you can get into aero bars comfortably, that is a cheap and easy solution. Then it starts to get more expensive, right? Like if you're going to start talking about aero wheels or an actual dedicated TT bike, those are things that definitely help, but then you're talking about in terms of, seconds per dollar, it becomes a much, more drastic thing. I definitely tell people to invest in a power meter. Power meters are so much cheaper these days. You can get single-sided pedal power meters for, I think, $300, maybe $400. So I definitely tell people power meters are a very, very worthwhile investment. They're not going to necessarily give you free speed, but they're going to make you so much smarter about your training and racing, and that is invaluable. The carbon shoes you mentioned are really interesting because the carbon shoes are definitely useful, but only if you're going at a certain pace. The science is pretty clear on this. If you're running slower than, say, a 730 mile, which I think is a 440 kilometer, you're not getting any benefit from those carbon shoes. So people should think long and hard before they invest in those shoes. I know everybody wants them. Everybody wants to look cool. And if you've got the money, then sure, I wouldn't tell you not to do it. But they're expensive, right? They're like $250 for shoes that are only going to last 200 miles. They don't last very long. So if you've got a limited budget and you're running a 9-minute mile, which is, I believe, a 6-minute kilometer, then put your money elsewhere. You don't spend on those things. There are other shoes that are going to suit you better. And carbon shoes should not be trained in. They should only be raced in because they are associated with injuries if you're training in them. And they don't last as long anyways. The other gimmickry that I think is worthwhile, that's about the end of it, really. There's so much that, listen, people are spending money on stuff that like AeroFit, which is that mouthpiece that people, I mean, it's useless. I mean, it's endless. So stuff that costs and has sort of mixed evidence. So there's a whole category of things that is like, it's not super expensive, but the evidence behind it isn't great, but there's definite evidence that it makes you feel good. So my best example is like the compression boots, Normatex or HyperAce, I think they're called. I own a pair. I like sitting in them. They feel good. There is no evidence that they make you perform better, zero evidence that they actually help with recovery. But you know what? They feel good. And the fact of the matter is like they make you sit on the couch after doing a hard workout, and they're probably beneficial just in that regard because it's forced rest. So those kinds of things I tell people, listen, it's not magic. But if you've got the $400 lying around burning a hole in your pocket, they feel good. So why not? The massage guns, same thing. There is zero evidence they do anything for anybody. But you know what? They feel good. So go for it. If you want it, why not? And there's a whole host of things that are like that. But again, just don't expect miracles. If you go in with like the right mindset, then you can benefit from some of these things psychologically without expecting major things.
Love those tips. Yeah, that aligns a lot with a lot of my philosophies there. Well said. So as we start to wrap up things here, just a couple final questions here. First off, like, what do you have in store for this year as a coach and an athlete? Any big races on the calendar for you, or any big goals you're looking to knock off?
Well, so my family is a big part of my team. I do everything in accordance with my family. We sit down every year and discuss what we're going to be doing this year. Me really, but them in support. And the decision was made after the last time I did Kona that Ironman is on hiatus for a while. So I'm just doing 70.3, which is fine. I really enjoy 70.3. I feel like it's a very different racing experience. And I came to love racing Ironman, and I would love to do another one. But for now, it's such a burden on the family that I'm totally fine doing 70.3. So I am doing Boulder, I'm doing Oregon, and I'm doing Tri-Cities. Two in the Pacific Northwest. Never been up there to race, and now I'm going twice this year. And then I'm off to New Zealand to do Worlds in Taupo in December. So that's
Nice.
my 70.3 season. I'm doing a big run block right now, so I'm kind of escalating up to a couple of half marathons, trying to get my run in the order that it used to be before I had a year of medical setbacks last year. So I'm looking forward to hopefully having a good run this year. That's what I'm doing athlete wise, coach wise. Just continuing to work with athletes. I've got a couple of really, really stellar Ironman athletes who are training, one for Lake Placid, one for Maryland. I've got a few 70.3 athletes that are also making great progress. And then I'm working at this camp. We have a camp at the Firstborn campus out in North Carolina that's coming up in May. So I'm really excited about that. And yeah, just keeping going. And I have place for athletes if anybody is looking. I've got a couple openings, so always looking to take on people if they're looking to make improvements. And the podcast keeps going.
Awesome. Sounds like a great schedule. Who are some people that you'd like to give a shout out to who've maybe inspired you or mentored you on your journey? I know that we talked about some, but kind of an open floor for you to give a shout out to some of those people.
Well, Steve Johnson, definitely. I mean, he was a big influence in my life, and he's missed every day. Tim Crowley was my first coach. I was with him for 12 years and had a big impact on me. Lance Watson has been a mentor for me as a coach and now as my personal coach. Definitely my friends. I am friends with some amazing women in the sport, and they continue to serve as an inspiration for me, but also as an anchor. They keep me very focused on making sure that I'm always attuned to women's issues in the sport, and I try to be very, very focused on that in everything that I do, especially on the podcast. And that's Juliet Hockman, my colleague at Life Sport, Benny Grau Thompson, who just was the overall winner in Puerto Rico at the
Nice.
tender young age of the 50 to 54 age group. She won in Puerto Rico. She's
Wow.
amazing. And my dear friend Kelly Pois, who is a coach and an athlete in Australia, fighting a very, very bad injury in her hamstring, but continues to be just an amazing, amazing athlete. And the three of them, we are thick as thieves, and we are just always they always inspire me, and we always lean on each other for inspiration and for whatever we need. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention, of course, my wife Sandra and my kids, my three kids, Adam, Lauren, and Samantha, Sam, who are definitely the main reason I do everything I do.
And I'm not sure how big of a triathlon fan you are in terms of watching races and stuff like that, but do you have any hot takes in terms of predictions for who we'll see in terms of Olympic champions or our Ironman world champions or T100? Any predictions there for this year?
I don't follow the short course stuff, so I'm
Okay.
not really attuned to who is in the thick of the Olympic qualifying. I am friends with Matt Sharp, and I know that his wife, Kirsten Casper, is trying very hard to qualify for the U.S. team. But other than that, I really am not attuned to the short course stuff. For the long course stuff, I've been a longtime fan of Lionel Sanders. I think that his story is amazing. I have met him a couple of times. He's always struck me as a really genuine, vulnerable kind of guy. And I think he's just a great story. I think that I'd love to see him have a couple more victories this year. I think that he's kind of probably at the end of his window for winning those kinds of races. But if anybody can do it, it's him. There's so many great names in the sport, right? The sport is really, we're seeing a bunch of new names coming up now. I mean, we saw with India Lee just last weekend that this and she's been around for a long time. We just haven't seen her have that kind of success. So I think that we can look forward to seeing both older athletes like oh gosh, what's her name? Oh, see, I'm blanking now. But I mean, we have a mix of older athletes who are continuing to Sky Munch. That's who I was thinking of, who are continuing to have success, and then younger athletes who are breaking onto the scene who are also just amazing. And it's both men and women. And it's so hard to predict because the field just seems so wide open at any time. I mean, we always think, oh, the Norwegians are going to show up and win, but I don't think that's true anymore. So we'll see. We'll see as the season goes. I mean, I think Oceanside is going to be the first real event where we'll have a good sense of what's going on. And I guess that's men only, I think, this year at Oceanside because it was women last year. So
it's men's and women's. Jess is racing actually. That's her
awesome.
first pro race at Oceanside. So
yeah, it's gonna be a big one.
Is Tamara racing again there?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's awesome. Good luck for you. And that's going to be a great event. I know Matt Sharp's racing there. And that's where we'll see, I think, who's in early season form. So
yeah, should be exciting. So as we wrap up, how can people follow along on your journey and how can they follow the podcast?
So the podcast is at is anywhere you find podcasts. Just be sure it's TriDoc with a C, not TriDot with a T. That's a different story. Not going to go there. But anyways, TriDoc Podcast, TRIDOC. You can also find the website for that is the TriDocPodcast.com. I also have an Instagram, which is TriDoc Coaching, all one word. And there's a private Facebook group for the TriDoc Podcast, which you can just search for. And there's a few easy questions. If you've listened to any episode of the podcast, you'll be able to get into that group and you can ask questions there or just join the conversation about the podcast. Those are the easiest ways to follow me. And I have a YouTube channel, but I don't, unfortunately, I'm just too busy to post many videos, but all of the episodes of the podcast go up there as well.
And you mentioned that you're open to athletes. So if there's a listener who is looking to coach with you, where's the best way for them to reach out to you?
So they can reach me at my website, which is tridoccoaching.com, or they can go to the lifesportcoaching.com website and find me there. Either website will work. I have a contact form on my TriDoc Coaching website, and they could even reach out through Instagram or Facebook, either one. Any way through the interwebs. I'm happy to. And also, and I have you could also email me, TRI_DOC@iCloud.com.
Careful. You're just going to be flooded with all of our listeners now.
I can only hope.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. It was a pleasure to have you on the show and to get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciated it.
Wow. How great was that? I always learned so much from these endurance icons. If you enjoyed the podcast as well, please consider liking us across social media, subscribing to us on YouTube, or giving us a 5-star rating on wherever you listen to your podcasts. We appreciate you and your support so much. We wish you happy training and we'll see you back next week.